about their manifesto. So let's listen in.
The government believes that our membership of the European Union has brought real benefits to the United Kingdom through jobs, peace and security. Through our membership, we belong to the world's largest trading bloc. Over half of the United Kingdom's trade is with the EU, with an estimated 3.5 million British jobs linked to it. Our membership allows us to live, work and travel in Europe. Those words, ladies and gentlemen, are the best the government can do to defend our membership of the European Union, and were spoken against me in the Lords 6 weeks ago. They are words which will have been honed by dozens of clever bureaucrats over a long period of time, and which were repeated often during the passage of the Lisbon Treaty through our House. They also have an optional extra sentence, and it goes like this. Our EU membership gives us a seat at the top table of world affairs. We increase our influence by giving up our sovereignty. That they mean your sovereignty, of course. Now, ladies and gentlemen, you and I can see through all this. We can see it for what it is, the self-serving dishonesty of the political class. In fact, there isn't a word of simple truth in any of it, and I don't need to tell you why. But the trouble is that our political class does appear to believe it. They really do. I suppose they have to, because our membership of the EU gives so many of them such a comfortable way of life at our expense. But they have a problem. The British people are not fools, and they are beginning to understand that over the last 40 years they have been steadily deceived and betrayed into what is now almost total subservience to Brussels. The slow-motion coup d'etat, as Christopher Booker has so aptly described it. The British people have other reasons to be angry. And if you don't mind, I will quote what I said in the Lords over 2 years ago, when I was trying to warn then of the growing gulf between the political class and real people. Over the past 50 years, we, that's the political class, have brought this country pretty low. 40% of our children leave primary school, and 16% leave school unable to read and write properly. Our whole health service is in crisis. Our police are overwhelmed. Our prisons are bursting with the mentally ill and the illiterate. Our transport system is inadequate. Our armed forces are underfunded, overstretched and undervalued. And even their morale is beginning to crack. Our border controls have been deliberately abandoned so that our inner cities are increasingly uncomfortable and explosive places. And perhaps most worryingly of all, Islamist terrorists are on the march, many of whom are homegrown. That, ladies and gentlemen, was before the credit crunch and the parliamentary expense scandal, which have turned the people's feeling from disdain to anger, and now, amongst many, to hatred. Indeed, the focus groups we have recently commissioned show that there's one deep common attitude, shared by nearly everyone we consulted, and that is anger and distrust of the political class. To these feelings we must add frustration. Frustration because the British people feel that there is nothing they can do to make any difference, that whatever they do, they can't change the system. And of course they're right about that too, which may be why some 40% of them no longer bother to vote in general elections. Modern governments are elected by 40% of the 60% who do bother to vote, or some 24% of the electorate. And those governments now make only some 20% of our national law. The rest is made in Brussels, where the government has some 9% of the votes, in a secretive system which renders the House of Commons, for which the people are allowed to vote, wholly irrelevant. Ladies and gentlemen, I trust you will agree that that is a fair description of where we stand today, that I haven't exaggerated anything or made it sound more gloomy than it really is. If anything, the disastrous state of our public finances should make us even more fearful of the future. I think we can take it that the two most important subjects in the forthcoming general election will be the economy and immigration. We are told that the voters aren't really interested in Europe, that UKIP is a single-issue party, and that a vote for UKIP is a wasted vote, and that a hung parliament would be a disaster. Many of you who are PPCs will get that thrown at you all the time. So what are the answers to these suggestions? Well, we are obviously no longer a single-issue party, And the plain fact is that the easiest way, perhaps the only way, to solve the problems of our economy and immigration is to leave the EU. Yet all the three main parties are determined not even to talk about doing so, so the field is clear for us. What about the wasted vote? The answer to that is that if you want more of the same, more of the lib-lab con, if you want to make absolutely sure that nothing changes, then you must vote for one of them. If, on the other hand, you want to start the forces of change, then the only sensible thing to do is to vote UKIP. What about the voters not being interested in Europe? Well, they will be, if we can get them to see that getting out of it is really the only way to control our own borders and save our economy. What about the disaster of a hung parliament? The answer is that it would be infinitely preferable to another 5 years of any of the rest of them. I can't believe that the people will return a Labour government, which would of course be very bad news, but hardly much worse than a Conservative government with a big enough majority to last 5 years. I say this because David Cameron has ruled out any sort of referendum on our relationship with Brussels for 5 years. 5 more years of ever deeper integration. After that, it may be very difficult to escape. We will no longer be enmeshed on every side in the tentacles of the corrupt octopus. As we are today, we will be in its belly. So whatever the doubts about a hung parliament, a Conservative victory would be an absolutely certain disaster, just as bad as Labour. It would be the final extinction of what millions of our forebears have died for over hundreds of years, and we must not let it happen. When the true extent of our national financial disaster is finally revealed after the election, a hung parliament is unlikely to last very long, perhaps not even a year. Then there will be another election, and UKIP must be able to show the main parties, perhaps particularly the Conservatives, that they cannot form a government unless they promise a referendum on whether we want to stay in the EU or leave it. We have to do well enough in this election to make that clear and unavoidable. The pointlessness of voting for the main parties is easily exposed. They say they want to start doing something very timid about immigration, yet they all agree that they want to let 70 million Turks into the EU, and so into this country. You simply can't marry up those two positions. Then they're talking about cutting 7 or 8 billion in public expenditure. But what is the figure we send in cash to Brussels every year? 16 billion. If we look beyond straight cash, the Taxpayers' Alliance estimates that our EU membership may be costing around 120 billion a year, the equivalent of £2,000 per person per annum. When you look at it like this, ladies and gentlemen, our membership of the European Union is really a no-brainer. So this, ladies and gentlemen, is the political mould which we are now setting out to break. We must do so by trying to tell the truth about many controversial issues, straight talking. For instance, we must question the whole theory of man-made climate change. We are about to spend some £18 billion a year for the next 40 years on renewable energy, on 10,000 pointless windmills, and so on. But what if the planet has started cooling, as a great many scientists believe? What if man's activity doesn't contribute to climate change one way or the other? Wouldn't it be better to wait and see before committing such ruinous figures to the atmosphere? Of course it would. And that is why we're calling for a royal commission, chaired by a High Court judge, to test the alarmist theories in the cool light of day. Ladies and gentlemen, we must also be prepared to talk openly about the advance of Sharia law in this country and the huge problem of Islamism worldwide. Like it or not, when we talk of terrorism nowadays, we are nearly always talking about a problem which comes from within Islam. We are not talking about a threat which comes from the Buddhists, the Hindus, the Sikhs, the Jews, or the Christians, not even Irish Catholics, and not the humanists. We are talking about Islam. We must do what we can to encourage the vast majority of the Muslim community, who are our peace-loving friends, to end their silence and speak out against their violent co-religionists. We must ask them to join us in saying that their preachers and teachers of hate have no place in this country and must be thrown out.